Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. Today's guest is Dr. Monika Stodolska, who is a professor within the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Additionally, she is the director of the Diversity Research Laboratory at her institute. Dr. Stodolska's research focuses on the roles of leisure, recreation, and sport in improving health and well-being among ethnic and racial minorities. Her studies have explored the development of ethnic identities among Latinos and African Americans, as well as cultural change and adaptation among immigrant populations. Other subjects that are prominent in her research include constraints on leisure, ethnic and racial discrimination in leisure settings, recreation behavior of minority populations in urban natural environments, physical activity among minority groups, and the roles of new technologies in leisure. For this episode of All Bodies Outside, our conversation will focus on constraints to accessing urban natural environments experienced by people of color, low-income individuals, and immigrant populations, and what can be done to help them overcome these barriers. Dr. Stodolska, what a pleasure it is to have you here on All Bodies Outside.
Welcome, Brian, and thank you for having me on today's podcast.
Yeah, that's fantastic that you got to join us. Thank you so much. So you're connected in from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and how long have you been there as a professor?
That's correct. I've been there since 1999, so almost 24 years now.
Wow. Wow, that's fantastic. And what's the weather like right now out by you? Have you
Cold, windy, and snowy.
Okay, we got hit by that yesterday, and I think that the weather comes through. I'm in Kansas, so the weather kind of comes through here and might get close to you. I don't know exactly where Urbana and Champaign are, but yeah, we had that yesterday.
We had some flurries today.
Okay, yeah, I'm actually looking forward to this afternoon. My son wants to. We're getting some sun right now, so my son wants to go outside and play some basketball later this afternoon when I'm done with work, and so we have a little hoop in our driveway. So we're going to go play some horse and whatnot and have some fun in the sun. So that'll be a nice change up from the cold week that we had. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, why don't we get into our conversation here and just kind of start looking at these different recreation and leisure constraints. And so to open up this conversation, the first question that I wanted to ask you was, why is it important to research recreation and leisure constraints?
It's a great question, Brian, and that's the research that I've been doing since my time as a PhD student in mid-1990s at the University of Alberta in Canada. And it's even more important now than it used to be back when I was a graduate student. We know that the U.S. population is very diverse, that more than 1/3 of the U.S. population now can be classified as members of ethnic and racial minorities, and their share of the U.S. population is going to increase in the future. The predictions are that by 2060, whites, non-Caucasian whites are going to constitute less than 60% less than half actually of the U.S. population. And we also know that visitation to natural environments, including urban parks, provides a lot of benefits for minority groups. It promotes their physical activity. It allows people to experience nature closer to their home, to reduce stress, to allow for relaxation, it helps to foster social relationships among people, both with their families, but also with other members of their ethnic communities. It increases sense of community and social capital. And even there are studies that say that participation in visitation to urban parks help to improve interracial relations. But at the same time, we also know that not all members of underprivileged populations have equal access to urban greenery. So we know that they experience a lot of constraints. So in our research, we try to understand what constraints they experience, how they navigate for those constraints or negotiate for those constraints, and what can we as a society, as researchers, and as recreation practitioners can do to help them overcome those constraints.
Wow, okay. And so during COVID, how did leisure and recreation change in urban natural environments? Did it increase or decrease? Did it stay the same? What did the research show on that?
It's a great question, Brian. I mean, we know that during COVID, a lot of people they try to limit their social interactions, and they had fewer opportunities to recreate in places like movie theaters and restaurants. A lot of places were closed, so people were actually using urban parks and greenery to escape from stress that COVID brought on upon them. They would meet with their family members, friends, sometimes in bubbles, sometimes 6 feet apart, walking, jogging. So, COVID actually has increased societal perceptions of the importance of recreation and especially recreation in nature.
Nice. Okay, so that's probably just another justification for the importance of researching these different types of constraints. Uh,
Definitely.
and something in your explanation that you gave after that first question was, you're talking about that, not everyone has equal access, and so I wanted to kind of just hear about that. And why is it that people don't have, access?
Brian, so access traditionally has been conceptualized in more of a physical term as geographic proximity to parks, to urban natural environments, or travel distance. So, for example, the question was, do you have a park within 10-minute walk from your residence? Or can you get to a park within 5 minutes of a car ride? For the last 15 years, I would say 13, 14, 15 years, we began to define access in more broader terms. We understand access not only as physical access to parks, but also as perceived access. And when it comes to physical access, we know, for example, that there are fewer natural environments in neighborhoods where minorities are concentrated. We know that a lot of parks that are available in minority neighborhoods, they're smaller in size. They don't have certain types of facilities. The facilities that they do have are not as well as maintained as facilities in well funded parks. And we also know that there are other constraints that limit participation among minority groups. For example, high cost of activities, the fact that they may not be able to get to recreation programs. Some of the interviewees whom I spoke with a couple of years ago have told me, well, I don't have a car. We only have one car per family. We can't afford gas. Some people who are undocumented immigrants may be concerned about driving without a driver's license. A lot of people do drive without a driver's license, but they're not going to take a risk of taking their children to park and potentially being caught and deported just to use a recreation. Cost of activities is, again, as I said, a big factor when it comes to access, but also uh, factors such as safety. And we can talk about it a little bit more in depth if you would like to, but the fact that some recreation environments are unsafe, that they're located in environments and neighborhoods where there are very high crime rates, there's a lot of gang activity. There's also perception of access. Do they feel welcome in natural environments? Are recreation practitioners, do they create an atmosphere of inclusion? Do minorities feel welcome in recreation buildings? Do they feel welcome in parks? Are there interracial tensions in the neighborhood? Um, do they perceive that they're going to be discriminated in parks and other natural places? One of the recent surveys that we did, we surveyed users and non-users of recreation resources. 20% of non-users told us that they are afraid of discrimination in natural environments.
Mm.
So it has actually gone up significantly since late 2000s. So there are a lot of barriers a lot of constraints that prevent or decrease minorities' available opportunities to visit nature.
Yeah, and on that safety note, you kind of talked about, sometimes some of these urban natural environments there might be, some gang activity. Have
Hmm.
you've conducted research on some
Yeah.
gang activity in these places? And I don't know if you want to. I mean, it's probably a lot to talk about. I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to talk about a little bit of that safety component, because it is urban natural environments, and the nature of gangs, from my understanding, has changed quite a lot since the '70s.
Oh,
Actually,
definitely.
yeah, it's
Definitely.
not
That's
as
a
organized.
great question, Brian. We started that research in the mid 2000s, and This was not our intention to study gang as a leisure activity or as a constraint to leisure. It was a broader study that a colleague of mine, Dr. Kim Shin-yu, and I conducted in 2005, 2006. We specifically asked residents of central city Chicago communities about their constraints to using natural resources, including parks. And what people mentioned at length was crime. They were concerned about the gang activity in urban communities. So we started asking more questions. What about gang crime? Would you feel safe walking with your child in park? How do you negotiate those crime-related constraints? And that led us to actually broader research that we conducted specifically on gangs as a constraint to use of outdoor recreation and physical activity among minority children, particularly from Latino backgrounds, and that this research was conducted by a colleague of mine, Dr. Lisa Berdychevsky, Dr. Kim Shin-yu, and myself. So we did follow-up studies on this.
Wow, fantastic. That sounds like quite a study. And I
Yeah.
don't know much about that research, but when I was preparing for this episode, I actually came across like I think it was maybe a YouTube video of you talking and just kind of talking about, you know, how gang culture has changed. There's a lot more of a money incentive and a lot more kind of drug movement. And there could be a
Yep.
lot of just different, and there's the gang activity is actually more pronounced than I think what was originally thought.
It is more pronounced, more violent, more difficult to police. Um, as we discussed on a different podcast, there a lot of gang activities related to narcotics trade and sale. We see a lot of influence of drug cartels from Mexico, even up as far as Canada right now.
Wow.
So it's becoming more dangerous to police to monitor this activity. There's bigger amount of money involved, but also the United States and much of the society has changed since the murder of George Floyd, and there is a big distrust among minority communities towards police. So
Mhm.
that becomes even more. Uh, it makes it even more difficult for police to work with communities to tackle those crime issues.
Yeah, and that's really wrapped up in that safety issue.
Hmm.
What a complex issue. But I will drag us back into our conversation for today,
Okay.
focusing on constraints. And so, why don't we continue on that path? And I'll kind of get into my next question, and that is just kind of looking at social privilege and how does
Hmm.
social privilege affect constraints? And me being a white male, slender white male, highly educated, like I definitely have more privilege, but how does social privilege affect constraints?
Brian, so when you talk about social privilege, you can talk about issues such as socialization to different activities. We very often don't consider how our experiences from childhood affect our recreation behavior today. The
Mm,
fact that you and I may have grown up in middle class families and we had access to different resources, we weren't socialized to outdoor recreation, to visiting parks, maybe in safe neighborhoods, to traveling to national parks, to Rocky Mountains. Other peoples have not had those opportunities, and so this may not be a part of their social capital to access nature, but particularly in nature farther away from home. Another big issue is where our social privilege really comes into place is the locations where we live, the neighborhoods where we live. You know, until we conducted our gang study, I really never paid attention to how privileged I am to live in the neighborhood where I live. And I live in a small community, small rural community outside of Champaign, maybe 25 miles west of Champaign. And I go out at night at 10, 11 p.m. I walk my dog, and my neighbors go out in the evening. It is completely safe neighborhood. People allow their children to run or to run, ride their bikes, walk with the dogs, and the only concern that parents may have is that the children don't go out on the main road. While in a lot of underprivileged communities, again, crime, discrimination, traffic, drive-by shootings are a daily occurrence, and parents are incredibly concerned about even allowing their children to spend time in their own backyards, not to even mention to go to a local park unattended.
wow.
Another thing that you alluded to is the fact that we are white. I mean, we don't experience the type of discrimination that a lot of people of color do. So, if we witness crime, or if we are, exposed to crime, we um, don't concern ourselves with calling 911 and having a police assist us, versus for many people of color, interactions with the police can be highly dangerous, and this is something to be avoided for good reasons.
Yeah, and I feel like just a little bit more touch on that white component too. Is it's sometimes being white is perceived as being easier to work with the police too.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
um,
I don't feel concerned about calling police, and probably you don't either,
yeah.
versus friends of mine who are people of color. They think twice when their children have interactions with the police, because they expect the worst.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, all this safety around urban natural environments, that's really challenging for, say the development of young adults or even children for their leisure and recreation. They might be more physically constrained to stay inside versus being outside, interacting with others, gaining social bonds, learning how to navigate maybe just, some minor challenges amongst other people, developing those social skills. Those are all things that kind of handicaps people in a way when their safety is perceived not to be there.
I totally agree. And what we find from our research is that a lot of parents are encouraging their children to stay indoors.
Mm,
They feel safer when their children after school stay at home and play video games, because it's simply too dangerous to be outside, which obviously has developmental effects on children. It leads to obesity level, it decreases their social skills, not to mention other physical effects of not being able to access outdoors play. And I mean,
yeah.
one of the studies that we did in a little village in Chicago, the only environments where children felt safe was in the vicinity of their homes, inside of their homes, inside the classrooms, or at YMCA or Boys and
Wow.
Girls Club. And when I
Wow.
asked them why, they said, well, because we can play basketball in the basement of YMCA, and it's safe because the walls are thick and there are adults protecting us.
And the walls are thick. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow. So that's got a lot to it. And so it's important, I'm going to use the term that you used earlier, but I feel like it's important for those of us that do have that social capital, that social privilege, to use our social responsibility to help alleviate these constraints. And so, how can social responsibility be used to help alleviate these constraints?
Well, we have privilege related to our class, race, education. We can speak for people who cannot speak for themselves. We can work with organizations that provide recreation resources, that are responsible for upkeep and maintenance of parks, that to help them understand that uh, it is their responsibility to provide recreation opportunities to all, not only to people who have this social and cultural privilege, but also to those who may struggle with accessing nature. And our work with the Urbana Park District, for example, here in Champaign, is a great example of that. It was actually the Urbana Park District who reached out to us, because they realized that even though their community is very diverse, they don't see a lot of people from underprivileged groups in their recreation programs and in their parks. And they reached out to our diversity lab, and they said, well, we need help. Could you find out what's happening? Why is it that people are not visiting those locations? So for the past five years, 6 years right now, we've been working with them to understand and help to alleviate constraints to recreational and park use among local underprivileged citizens. But Urbana Park District is light years ahead of other locations. They were the ones who actually understood that they have the social responsibility to provide recreation to all, versus we also know of other locations where recreation organizations or park districts believe very deeply, and they have this entrepreneurial approach to service delivery. They believe that only people who can pay a certain amount of money should be allowed to use their resources. So in those cases, it's really organizational changes are needed, and we as recreation educators, this is our responsibility to help make this change happen. We have the
Yeah.
knowledge, we have the passion, we have um, the tools in our toolkit to help change the society, and we should work both with recreation professionals, with administrators, with students, help younger generation to understand how important recreation is, and the fact that hundreds of millions of people in our country don't have access to those beneficial environments.
Yeah, I feel like that's a macro level health concern.
It is. It definitely is.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said earlier too, though. You know, using our privilege, using our social capital to help foster change for those that don't have the voice that we have, or their voice isn't
Exactly.
listened to as much. And I think that plays
Exactly.
into that social responsibility that you explained.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was fantastic. So then, what other factors are important to consider regarding constraints negotiation for these underrepresented groups?
Well, you can look at those factors at different levels. You can look at the individual um, backgrounds and capacities and characteristics of people, whether or not what kind of environments they grew up in. Do they have the social capital to negotiate some of those constraints? You can look at their personal psychological characteristics. You can look at their education level, their health status. People, for example, who suffer from depression and anxiety are going to be less likely to try to overcome those constraints versus people with more with different social and psychological skill sets are going to be better equipped, higher self-efficacy, are going to be more likely and more capable of overcoming those constraints. Another level is obviously the interpersonal level, where a lot depends on our interactions with our social environment, our groups, our loved ones. Do we have others who would support our participation or negotiation of constraints? Do we have someone who can actually go out with us? Do we have someone who could help us advocate for change? And lastly, the more of a institutional societal level, um, context, the neighborhood in which where you live, the city, the policies of the local government, the society in which you live, the sort of the microcosm in which every individual operates. In immigration research, we call it the context of arrival. Basically, this is the society that surrounds you. What are the attitudes of people who live in your community? What are they going to say when they see a local black person jogging in on their street, or a couple of black women who are bird watchers? How are they going to react to them? What are the policies that protect the right of people who are members of underprivileged groups? So, obviously people's ability to negotiate their constraints in a small town deep in the south, rural town where there are a lot of prejudices, is going to be different than in a middle class urban community somewhere in the northeast or in the northwest. So where the laws may be the same that protect our rights, people's ability to exercise their rights may be different.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I really am thankful that you gave that explanation. Discuss the different levels of
Hmm.
individual, interpersonal, and at that institutional level. And so far throughout our conversation, we've been kind of talking kind of homogenously about these different groups and whatnot. And so, but at the end there, you kind of talked about different regional differences and whatnot. But as you said at the start of the episode, the population of the United States is diversifying more and more and more. And so, kind of getting out of this homogenous tone down to more heterogeneous aspect, there's a lot of different constraints that affect people differently with different
Of course.
historical backgrounds and whatnot. And there's also, historical perceptions of people. How do we cater to all those nuances as well that, accounts for that heterogeneous population of the United States?
$1 million question, Brian, and this is actually something that we've been arguing for many years in the leisure literature, and also in our work with organizations. We used to have this very homogeneous approach to minority groups. We used to divide people using those broad strokes of whites, Latinos, African Americans, and Asians, versus, while we know perfectly well that those groups are extremely heterogeneous. So in our one of our recent studies that we did with the Urbana Park District, we divided groups based on their socioeconomic class, perceived perceived socioeconomic class, race and ethnicity, immigration status, ability status, sexual orientation, felt gender, and so on. And we, it was clearly, our findings clearly showed that, for example, Latinos of middle class status are not gonna experience, of who are white passing, quote unquote, are not gonna experience the same constraints that who are experienced by Latinos of working class, who are undocumented, who are more visible minorities. So when we work with organizations, we strongly advocate for a tailored approach to delivery and for helping people to negotiate those constraints. When reaching out to populations, let's say Latino populations, do not use those broad generic categories. If they want to increase participation, i.e., lower constraints among working class undocumented immigrants from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras, they should work for organizations who serve those populations. Reaching out to the entire Latino community in Champaign, Urbana is not going to make a lot of difference because that community, again, is very heterogeneous. We have Latino middle upper class faculty who work at the University of Illinois. They're not going to experience the same constraints as laborers from Guatemala.
Right.
So what we advocate for is a very narrowly tailored approach.
Gotcha. And so I think that's probably really important for recreation agencies to
Yes.
understand, which brings me to my next question is how can understanding this kind of narrow, tailored approach to constraints be used by recreation agencies?
It can be done. First of all, in my work with recreation agencies, I realized that there is very little, they have very little knowledge about the population that lives in their districts, in their areas. They know that the population is diverse, but they don't understand who lives there, what are the benefits of recreation for those populations, what are the constraints, and how the constraints can be negotiated. So what we advocate for is, first of all, get to know your local population. Once you know who your population is, um, identify specific characteristics of the population and constraints that they experience. We know that cost is going to be a barrier. We know that lack of time is going to be a barrier. But very likely there is something else as well. Maybe this could be racial tensions because of the incident that occurred 3 years ago in a local park. Local recreation agencies need to know that. In the case of Urbana Park District, it was in marketing. People felt welcome. They have done amazing job decreasing the cost. They got a $500,000 grant in the last 5 years to provide free scholarships to local children. So they were able to decrease this constraint of cost. What we found out, however, is that simply people didn't know about those opportunities for engagement. So our recommendation to the district was to completely rethink their marketing strategies. So again, partner with local organizations, have a good relationship with the local police department, have a good relationship with the local school district, with the local churches, have access to organizations and establish partnership with organizations that are trusted by minority groups.
Mm.
And it can be a local Shriner's office, or it can be a local church, or it can be an organization that provides legal aid to immigrant groups. Use those organizations as contacts, as inroads to the community. So first of all, understand who your population is.
Mm-hmm.
Second, understand what their constraints are, what happened in the community, what specific constraints they experience, and then partner with local organizations that help you build inroads to that community. Make sure that they trust you before you actually start doing the outreach.
Yeah, that is fantastic recommendations. I really like that last component there, the third one.
Hmm.
You partnering with these organizations
It's
that are
critical.
trusted, and and in getting into with them and getting trust in there before then.
It's absolutely critical, Brian. When we were doing our initial survey in Urbana and we were introducing ourselves as a team who works for the UPD, Urbana Park District, a lot of people thought that we work for the Urbana Police Department. So they were closing doors in our
Ah,
faces, right?
yeah.
When we corrected ourselves and started saying that we work actually for the Urbana Park District, they had no idea what the Urbana Park District is. But
Mhm.
everybody knows who the local school district person is. People know their pastors. People know uh, lawyers who help immigrant families fight deportation. Once you build those networks with local community organizations, once you know who the key stakeholders are, then you will be able to build bridges to local minority populations. And by minority, we not only mean members of racial and ethnic groups. These are people with disabilities, veterans, older adults, LGBTQ populations. The underprivileged, underserved is a big group.
Yeah, a big group and a very diverse group within
Yeah,
it.
it is.
So how do we, and maybe this is getting outside of your research, but how do park agencies gain this community relevance on, I feel like, yes, it's simplistic, but at the same time, it's probably complicated. There's a lot of different components to, where do you go? How do you recognize maybe this church or this social place is going to help us boost our relevance with this type of group? Like, I feel like that's probably something that's a little bit challenging too, but that community relevance is so
Well,
important.
you need to learn your own community. And by community, I don't mean a city of 2 million. I mean a local neighborhood and a town of maybe 30, 40,000 people. You the park districts, the best approaches that I have seen is um, park districts having dedicated people who are responsible for the outreach. They get
Mm,
to know their community members. Those community organizations, they make the first step. They do the outreach. What is critical in that outreach is consistent presence.
mm.
It's not that we are here to develop one program for you and then we are going to withdraw. No, it's making people understand, making communities understand that we are here for the long haul. We are going to be with you, and our goal is to invest in your group, in your community. The next step, which I think the UPD has done brilliantly, is to invite those community representatives to form an advisory board.
Ah, nice.
And
Yeah.
so they have a community advisory board that consists of leaders of those community organizations. Leaders get to know what UPD is, what the organization is, what their philosophy is, what they provide. They understand that this is a safe space. And those leaders are the conduits between the organization and the local communities. That may be very distrustful of Park District or YMCA or another entity in their neighborhood.
Yeah, Monica, that's fantastic. A community advisory board, and that's something that I've heard regularly be a problem is that at the decision making levels of these park agencies, there's not representation. There's not a
Exactly.
variety of perspectives, and that is overcome with a community advisory board.
It is. It's not only, for example, with the Urbana Park District, they have their board of directors, they have their different levels of committees, but the community advisory board plays a critical role in all the decisions that the UPD is making, from building, investing in a facility, to designing new programs, parades, community events. They let the organization know what the community needs. So instead of having this top-down approach where we have, let's say, Chicago Park District saying, well, we are going to celebrate St. Patrick's and then we're going to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, it is the community who is telling the organization, this is what we need, this is what we need, this is what we need.
Nice, nice. So, put it as an example. It's going to a little bit oversimplify, but say this podcast is called Old Bodies Outside, and let's say I wanted to put on a 10K race event, and I wanted to have all these different community members there. I can't make that decision. I need a community advisory board to help me connect with participants to get them to come to that race.
Precisely. Precisely. You are Brian Peterson. You're a white young guy, and whom a lot of people don't know, don't trust. They have no idea what your motivations are. Versus if you gain the trust of people who are already trusted by the community, you've already made the first step, the critical step.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
much easier for you to get to know 10 people who are the key stakeholders in the community than to convince 10,000 people to show up for your event.
yeah. That's fantastic. I love that community advisory board idea, and that is sounds very effective.
Yep.
It sounds very effective. So pulling this out from your research, Monica. So, what is your favorite leisure and recreation activity, say in an urban natural environment?
Oh, um, I'm not a very urban person. I'm a very
You're,
outdoorsy person.
yeah, and you did say you live in a rural area, don't
I
you?
live in a rural
Yeah.
area and I spend all of my pretty much most of my leisure time in the mountains and hiking and skiing. But when I'm in an urban environment, I like to go to parks. I love dogs. So spending time with dogs and walking in parks, going to cafes, um, that brings me a lot of joy. But again, getting out of the city as much as possible is this is who I am.
Yeah. I live out in Kansas, and I live in an area of Kansas that's called the Flint Hills, and so we have a little bit of rolling terrain. I'm getting excited for this summer. I'm going to go to what we have. We have an event nearby called the Flint Hills Symphony, and they bring the symphony out into the prairie fields, and people bring their kind of camp chairs, lounge chairs out, and watch the symphony. That's something that I'm super excited to do this
That's
summer.
fantastic.
Yeah, but I also want to ask you about your dog. So I have two dogs myself. I have and they're both about 2.5 years old. I got them as puppies at the same time, just so they could play with each other and help my sanity. But I have a Vizsla and
Mhm.
a Boxer, and they're very different, which is kind of fun. So, what kind of dog? Do you have more than one dog?
I have two. I have a German Shepherd and a Saint Bernard, and their personalities are completely different.
Yeah, they are. Oh, that's fantastic. How fun is that? And so, how old are your dogs?
German Shepherd is 3, and the Saint Bernard is 5. And Saint
Okay.
Bernard is a big lap dog, and he drools, and he's a big teddy bear. And the German Shepherd, I'm training him in search and rescue, so he's a working dog. So we
Nice,
do a lot
nice.
of training with him, and outside of my work hours, whenever we can get out into the woods and train, that's what we do.
Fun. That is so
Yeah,
much fun. My dogs bring a lot of just happiness into my life and joy. I love being
same.
around them a lot. And so my dogs, my Boxer's 60 pounds, my Vicious 44 pounds, but your dogs are probably 20 pounds or
Oh,
more.
oh, easily, easily. Argos, the Saint Bernard is 140-ish, and the German Shepherd is
Yeah.
probably pushing 90 right now. It's over 90, so
Wow. Wow.
quite a lot of dogs.
I have a big king size bed at home, and my dogs are 60 pounds and 44 pounds, barely fit in my bed to the point where I'm like, okay, you only get to sleep in bed on the weekends because I need to, on the weekdays, get good sleep. But my gosh, they need their own beds. They're so big.
Yeah, they have their own bags. We wouldn't allow them on the furniture. They are shedding now, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's that time of season. Well, Monica, I really appreciate you coming on here. I thought this was a fantastic conversation. I feel like I learned a lot and was able to make some really great connections. So I really appreciate that. You gave a great depth of explanations, but that was quality and accessible for the listening audience. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure. Thanks again for the invitation and for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I'm going to throw on the outro music and we'll call it an episode.